Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Walter Scheidel, who is a professor of humanities, classics, and history at Stanford University, also the author of, 17 books? I have only two of them with me, the most recent two. Most recent one is called What is Ancient History? And I feel like there's a missing, subtitle there, and why should it exist, if at all, right? That's the subtitle. And then also this book called The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. Welcome, Walter.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I thought maybe we'd start off with this book, What is Ancient History? I remember when I was studying history as an undergraduate, they had courses in early modern European and American, African, Asian, everything. But when I wanted to learn about the history of Greece and Rome, I had to go over into a completely different department, right? And the classics department. And not only was it sort of a different department, but they also seemed to have a very different methodology, right? So what we did, the texts that we read, we read Plutarch and Thucydides and Suetonius and Herodotus, right? And I was super frustrated. I was like, wait a second, where's the history here? And I remember 2 days before the final exam, I went to the library and I discovered Rostovtsev, right? And I just couldn't stop. I read the whole thing from beginning to end. I was so fascinated. And I realized, in fact, there is history being done about these time periods and places, but it's not in the history department. And so your book is sort of about how that situation came to be and whether it really, makes sense in a way. As a professor of classics, you seem to be calling for maybe an end to the discipline, even as a distinct department. Why? Do we need the classics in academia anymore as a distinct object or area of study?
Well, in a way, you just answered your own question, because if you are a historian and we are interested in history, the question is really whether classics is the most suitable or helpful template for accessing antiquity and realizing what antiquity really was and why it should matter to us in the here and now. So the experience you had is a very common one, because you have a field that was constructed maybe 200 years ago as revolving around texts, ancient languages, Greek and Latin, and the texts that had been produced in that language 2,500, 2,000, 1,500 years ago. And everything else was, in a sense, subsidiary to that, secondary to it. Yeah, you could study history and philosophy and art and archaeology and what have you, but there was always a primacy of philology, which works really well if you're interested in language and literature. So for this constituency, classics is just the perfect way of organizing the study of the past. If you're a historian, you may want to ask, well, why isn't ancient history, Greco-Roman history, part of history departments more generally? And to go beyond that, why do we mean mostly Greece and Rome when we say ancient history? I think we mean two things when we evoke ancient history. One is Greeks and Romans, maybe Egyptians and neighbors, if you're lucky, but not, Maya or early China and that sort of thing. Or more commonly, you refer to something you think is irrelevant and obsolete. You say, that's ancient history. Whenever you want to dismiss something, it's like, that's ancient history. So my book is about both of these meanings and why neither one of them really does any justice to the subject matter and to what our understanding should be of this particular part of history. I want to redefine it as a truly transformative foundational phase, not so much a period, but a phase of human development that unfolded on a planetary scale and needs to be studied accordingly. And once you embrace that kind of vision, well, classics is not quite, neatly compatible with that kind of approach.
Well, it seems like defenders of the classics want to emphasize how important it is for understanding our tradition, right? In other words, they want to emphasize the continuities, but it seems like the whole discipline was originally founded on the notion that these guys were distinct, right? And special and unique, right? How can both of those things be true simultaneously?
That's true. Every culture is distinct in some ways, right? But the claim at the time, 250, 200 years ago, coming out of continental Europe, Germany in particular, was the Greeks and the Romans, and especially the Greeks, are just better. They are superior. They're superior to all the other cultures we could possibly study in the more distant past. And that's part of a broader movement, the romanticizing movement. It's a bit of a backlash against modernity that really gets us paced in this period. Everything becomes modernized, rationalized. The sciences play a greater role in higher education. There's pushback from some people saying, wait a minute, we are maybe losing our soul, right? We are losing something really important. We have to redefine ourselves against this secularizing trend. And what they came up with, well, they couldn't really fall back on Christianity because it was a secularizing phase as well. Religion was being pushed back as well. So they ended up with essentially doubling down on the Greeks and the Romans, who had always been an object of study in Western Europe because of all the continuities and the languages and all the rest of it, but they had never been quite elevated to that kind of level as a superior model-like culture that we would need to understand it in all its aspects, not just for academic purposes, but to improve ourselves, to become better people. If you really, really understood what the Greeks were about, you are a better person, you're better able to withstand the pressures of modernity, to put it in a nutshell. And to make that happen, well, it would be ideal if people in what we call high school and secondary education would spend a lot of time learning not just Latin, but Greek, and at university anyway, and just to get into university would have to have Greek and Latin and all the rest of it. And that really becomes the norm throughout Europe, in the US, to a slightly attenuated degree, but still in the 19th century. And I had a very, very powerful hold on the entire educational system, not just the study of the past. And then, of course, over time it erodes, right? These things fall by the wayside, the requirements, the entry requirements go away. And what you end up with is a very sort of shrunken discipline of classics that exists on siloed off in individual departments, but still claiming to have some kind of privileged access to the study of the past that really matters, that one sliver of the past that is supposedly the most important and influential.
Now, it seems like this whole ball got rolling over in Germany with Herder and Winkelmann, and later with, I guess it was Humboldt and this guy, Friedrich August Wolff, right? He was a guy, and created this whole Alterum Wissenschaft. But the Germans, although they founded this whole thing, they seems to be the first ones to kind of abandon it, right? And it wound up kind of living on in the UK and the US, and it's in Germany they've more or less integrated the study of the ancients into these various departments, right? So that's true. Why did so maybe you could talk about the Germans and how they went through this evolution.
It's almost as if that particular template has a shelf life, right? Like a limited shelf life. And if the Germans are the first ones to develop and adopt it in the late 18th century, they're also the first ones to eventually abandon it. And they abandon it because of specialization. You can't just claim they are true classicists, people who master the literature and the languages and the history and the material culture all in equal measure. That's just no longer possible with the increase in knowledge and specialized techniques and so on. And so at some point they throw in a towel. And historians who study Greece and Rome end up in history departments, and there are separate classical philology departments for language and literature, and they train high school teachers and study literature at higher levels. You have separate archaeology programs. You would have people who study Plato in philosophy departments, that sort of thing. And that's now essentially the norm in continental Europe, give or take. And the alternative system is the one that comes out of Britain, which lags behind Germany, doesn't come up with a fully fledged version of classics that goes beyond just the language and the literature to encompass history, philosophy, and archaeology till maybe the late 19th century. So they start 100 years later, and they are still in that phase in a way. Although the template is experiencing increasing pressure, I think it's fair to say. More and more people are asking the questions that we are addressing here just right now today.
Yeah, and it seems like, I mean, a lot of the debate that people are engaging in today has to do with, I don't know, the organizational economics of the university, right? Like, where do these departmental boundaries lie? And it seems kind of puzzling. I mean, one would think that people just go and do research on what's interesting, and then it fits into whatever department happens to be there. But I think we all know in universities that these structures tend to shape the the research trajectories, right? I mean,
That is
boundaries matter. Departmental
correct.
structures seem to matter. And I think I had one guest who said that while academics are very radical politically, they're extremely conservative when it comes to their, organizational structures.
That is a perfect description. Yeah, it's certainly very true, because then these institutional structures take on a life of their own, and they become self-policing, self-enforcing, self-reinforcing, and then people self-select into these micro-traditions. They know exactly what to expect. That's what I want to do. I'm going to join. And so you don't get too many troublemakers, right? If you're a troublemaker, you may be put off by the whole thing before you even enter the profession, at least at higher levels of engagement, like grad school, let's say, or for a professional career. So it is a self-enforcing kind of form of path dependence, if you will. And unless there is some major paradigm shift or some major other shock to the system, there's really no sufficient force to reconfigure the way we approach the study of the ancient world. And I think that's a shame, because they're not just classics departments. They are in better resource institutions. You have units for Egyptology and Assyriology and early China studies and pre-Columbian, pre-Hispanic studies of the Americas, and so on. And they all inhabit a little niches, right? And they talk as little as possible to one another, even though they are studying essentially the same thing, because underneath, deep down, they are studying the same transformative phase of development that is really foundational to our way of life.
And it seems like there are challenges now to the scope of this discipline in a bunch of different dimensions. I mean, there's the temporal dimension, right, where the field of study might go further back in time or further forward in time. There's sort of the spatial dimensions where, there's a pressure to move beyond the study of the Mediterranean world. And then there's also kind of the methodological boundaries where there's a move into the study of material life and things that aren't necessarily in the text. I mean, can those boundaries shift while maintaining the kind of disciplinary boundary? I mean, or is it just sort of makes sense to blow the whole thing up?
It is fun in a way, because these boundaries have been shifting for the last 200 years. People invented prehistory about 200 years ago, when we couldn't really say very much about non or pre-literate cultures, because archaeology hadn't gone very far yet. It's totally different today. We can say a ton about non-literate cultures, and yet they're still studied in different programs. So the boundaries have already shifted very meaningfully, but there's now a huge tension between the disciplinary organization and what we are actually looking at and how we are doing it. And you would find it's no longer that everybody needs to know the same languages and reads the same text. Some people are highly skilled, sort of scientist-like archaeologists, right? You have very specialized skills in terms of how to analyze physical remains and the environment, and all the way to ancient DNA and ancient climate and all the rest of it. That's as far away from classics as it can possibly get. But it's a very important element of understanding the past and also teaching the past. So there's now a big friction, if you will, or a tension inherent in how everything is organized formally at the education, at the university level, and what people are actually doing. And yet they have to still try to fit into these templates, because otherwise they don't get hired or promoted, right? So it's a tension that the university has been very good at accommodating. And that goes back to what we said earlier, right, about the resilience, or the inertia, if you will, is probably the strongest word. And it's not quite clear that these tensions by themselves will lead to any kind of meaningful reconfiguration, even though it's long overdue. In temporal terms, that we go back farther in time. We don't wait till the Sumerians developed the first cuneiform script 5,000 years ago. We can actually look at other places earlier, which we do, but it should be fully integrated into the study of the past and not relegated to separate kinds of fields that are always latently, vaguely sort of second status like in a way. And in terms of spatial scope, right? That we inhabit a single planet. We know there's one species. It responds to environmental incentives, disincentives, that accounts for massive cultural variation. But deep down, people face similar challenges, and they should be studied accordingly. And we should try to understand how people at the time, often many thousands of years ago, put all kinds of innovations in place and bundle them together in very specific ways that really create our world in terms of material culture, in terms of social arrangements, institutions, cognitive frameworks, if you will, writing and literature, world religions and other belief systems and so on, that are still very much not with us. They really shape everything that we do today. So the world we inhabit today is like a supercharged version of what people set up in this formative period, but they do it all over the place. They do it in Europe and in West Asia and South Asia and East Asia and Africa and Mesoamerica and the Andes, independently in many cases. And they come up ultimately with similar kinds of trends and solutions. And those are the underpinnings of the world that we inhabit today. And we can't very easily escape. And unless we understand this, we have no chance of understanding how the world has come to be the way it is. So that kind of ancient history, to my mind, is the exact opposite of the colloquial, proverbial ancient history. Nothing could be less obsolete or irrelevant, right? It's really essential to our understanding of who we are or who we got to be.
And so this is sort of a call for, I don't know, this new discipline of foundational history, right? I mean, in other words, there are certain, I don't know, similarities between the cultures of what we call ancient Greece and Rome and, the Maya and in India and China and the Middle East, right? Certain themes or I don't know, methods that can be applied to understanding what's happening in these different regions that make more sense under one roof than under different roofs. Is that the idea?
The methods are already very similar. They're just being practiced by different people in different units, but the content itself is very quite similar in a way. That's not to say there's not a huge amount of cultural variation, but people tend to focus very much on that. What makes culture A different from culture B? Well, if you get beyond that, you realize that once you are in the Holocene and once you have food production and sedentism or pastoralism for that matter, you have very comparable outcomes in terms of urbanism, state formation, literacy, hierarchies, inequalities, any number of things. It's a really long list. I can give you pages of examples of all these various similarities. And people used to be very interested in this in the earlier stages of anthropology, but they went about it in a problematic way, shall we say, attaching value judgment, saying, oh, these people are at a lower, higher level of civilization development, and that's good or bad. We shouldn't be doing this, obviously. And it's not necessary, right? It's not necessary for understanding differences in the extent of change, the pace of change, and so on. But we have to be very much aware of this for a number of reasons. One is we live in a globally integrated world, so it makes sense for us to approach history in a similarly integrated way. And then we face planetary scale problems going forward, right? That we can best tackle, I think, if we understand how much humanity has long had in common, rather than what divides us, which is what we seem to spend most of our time studying.
Well, I think there's been a big debate over the role of Greek and Latin, right, as a sort of a prerequisite for studying in the ancient world. And I mean, I guess you could look at this debate two ways. I mean, it's not like people are saying you shouldn't have to know language. I mean, if you want to be a French historian, you got to know French, right? German. So is it just the privileged status of those languages and sort of the legacy of exclusion that they sort of evoke? I mean, presumably if you're going to be doing Mesopotamia or India or China, you're going to have to know some of those languages, unless you're doing something that's broadly comparative, like your book, The Great Leveler.
That's very true. And of course, there will always be specialists. I'm not saying we should get rid of specialism and be like the humanists hundreds of years ago. Everybody knows a little bit about many things. That's not longer feasible in the world we inhabit. But at the same time, at the very least, there should be more collaboration. And if you imprison people or they self-imprison in these little academic units, there will be very little collaboration beyond these artificial boundaries. So what we need more of is specialists who are very much aware of the fact that they are part of a larger whole and who actively go out and collaborate with other specialists who have their own languages and their own specialized skills to address bigger questions, which happens very, very little in the academic humanities, because the academic humanities in general privilege what I like to call heroic individualism, right? Where you take the individual and you are trained as an individual and credentialed and hired and promoted and assessed and rewarded and punished for what you do as an academic or a teacher or a researcher as an individual, which is totally different from what you get in the lab fields, right? In STEM fields, where of course people have to work in larger groups. It's to some extent different from the social sciences. It's different even from field archaeology. You can't be an archaeologist by yourself. You wouldn't get very far, right? You have to be part of a multidisciplinary collaborative group, and that's standard practice. And yet people are still always pulled back into this kind of individualistic framework and template. And that's just a very big obstacle to getting any kind of viable globalized engagement with any period of history, and certainly with the ancient world.
Well, if we want to look at a template for a book that kind of blows up a lot of these boundaries, I mean, we don't have to look any further than this book, The Great Leveler, which is a history of equality and inequality. And I mean, there are some studies on this topic, but very few of them go all the way back to, right, hunter-gatherer days, and very few of them actually cover virtually every geography on the planet. And I guess, one question I have is, this must have seemed like a very difficult book to do methodologically, right? Because, if you're Thomas Piketty, you can look at tax records, from the IRS or whatever. But if you're trying to figure out inequality in ancient Rome, or even, in Babylon or Acadia, I mean, it's pretty difficult. I mean, you have to know a bit about archaeology and so forth. I mean, how did you go about thinking about figuring out how to take something like a Gini coefficient and spread it across time and place?
So I think the first step was the external inspiration, if you will. As an ancient historian, I had to read Piketty's work first. Not the famous book, but his earlier studies that I'd been familiar with because I knew some of his former students and all that. And then you have the inspiration. You ask yourself, wait a minute, what he talks about for the last 100, 200 years, that major crisis, reduce inequality, that sounds very familiar because I've come across case studies, separate, isolated case studies from the late Middle Ages, from particular parts of ancient history, from different parts of the globe. And let's see if there is some kind of overarching logic to it. So I was looking for this, and lo and behold, there is an overarching logic to it. And you find the same trends and dynamic and patterns across world history, pre-agrarian, not so much pre, but agrarian societies, industrial societies on all the various continents we have evidence for. How do I know this? Well, I actually would find it very difficult to work with the text lists from the 20th century because I'm not trained in this way. I didn't do archival work and all the fancy statistics that you need to make sense of this material. But I have a much better sense than any modern historian of what the limitations are, but also the opportunities of working with data sets they would consider to be very weird or potentially useless, like just archaeological data or data that tell you about physical well-being that you can derive from analysis of human bones and teeth, for instance, how you would read certain, there are text records, samples of text records from antiquity, from the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, often for individual cities, not for whole countries, but for local communities that keep these records. And in Europe, they often keep these records to the present day, right? They've been sitting in basements for 700 years, and you go there in Italy and other places, and they're still there. And people had just begun at the time when I started writing this book, publishing this material and putting out more case studies and producing intermediate syntheses in a way. I could not have done this work 10 years earlier. I would not have had the inspiration by Piketty's work, and I would not have had those case studies and intermediate synthesis that I could use to build on and all bring together and supplement with what I knew about to create this grand overarching narrative. So in a way, I did it just at the right time. The first time it had really become possible to attempt something like this, and I hope make it work.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're an historian, you inevitably have a very different view of contemporary debates, right? So, like during the pandemic, I was like, this isn't really the Black Death, or, when you hear about inequality, it's like, yeah, I could think of some previous periods in our history where, inequality was pretty bad also. So it kind of puts things in perspective. Yeah. But I remember when Thomas Piketty came to Berkeley and, was talking about the reversal of the Great Compression. And, it seemed to me like he was calling for a global war, He's like, all right, we want equality. I was thinking, well, there's really only a couple ways you can get that. And I don't think you really want any of them. And that seems to be, in a way, the message of the book. It's very difficult to find examples of trends in the direction of equality that weren't driven by something deeply catastrophic, like war or plague or state collapse or violent revolution. Did you sort of start off with that belief, or did you kind of come to this conclusion a little bit more, inadvertently?
Not really. I started out with this as a working hypothesis. And I fully expected to run into a lot of counterexamples, right? The moment I would actually go out there and look at all the detailed information, all the different case studies, I fully expected to be maybe half right or largely right, and being largely right would be good enough to write a book about it, and you have to take account of the various exceptions. That's what I expected. And the more I looked at the material and the literature for very different kinds of types, times, and places, I would always find the same result. So I had the sense, well, I really hit on something worth pursuing, right? And I was still actively looking for counterexamples, and I just couldn't find any. And so in the end, I had a 500-page book, and I looked at all the potential alternatives, right? What else might decrease inequality in a more peaceful fashion? But either it didn't really work, or people had sort of failed to appreciate to what extent violent disruptions were behind those peaceful reforms, right? You can say, oh, let's just raise taxes. That's going to solve our problems, or nationalize industries or whatever. And then historically you have to look at, well, when does this happen? It happens in the context of violent disruptions like the world wars or fear of Bolshevism or any of those things. So once you have the overarching model, you can contextualize all the more particular explanations that turn out to be just sort of epiphenomenal. They are not really different in a meaningful way. So I publish a 500-page book, and then I sit back and I think, now people are going to come out of the woodwork, and they're going to say, I know why this book is wrong, because there are all these counterexamples that Scheidel ignores. Well, that was, 8 years ago? I'm still waiting. I did a survey last year. I looked through all this, the citation surveys, and tried to find all the publications that have engaged with my work, expecting pushback, right? That's what you get in academia, get pushback. And I didn't really quite get it. There was some pushback that wasn't really based on anything that I would accept empirically. And there was a ton of confirmation, in a sense. Even people who set out to question the model would end up with results that would actually add further supporting evidence. So the more time passes, the more confident I get that there is really something to that model. And if there are exceptions out there, we don't seem to know about them. And maybe we don't know about them because it didn't really exist in any meaningful volume.
Yeah, there's a lot of rich concepts in here, one of which is this inequality possibility frontier, right? Which is, it's mathematically indisputable, but it's something which I had never encountered before in all of the literature. But it makes perfect sense, right? That, relatively poor societies simply mathematically can't have that much inequality. And the richer you are, the more inequality is possible, right? So in some sense, when we see more inequality, it's often reflecting the fact that the society has become more prosperous to some degree.
Yes, but at the same time, it's also difficult to have a society that is rich in the aggregate, all of whose members are poor. because then why would the society be rich? So there are all kinds of adjustment mechanisms you have to put in place. And Branko Milanovic, an economist, right, in New York, really pioneered this concept. And I picked it up and tried to run with it. And the more you think about this, the scarier it gets, because there are all kinds of factors and adjustments you have to take into account, which means it's actually almost impossible to come up with a single meaningful metric of inequality. We think we have them. We have a Gini coefficient, top income share, top wealth share, 1%, 10%, the famous 1% everybody always talks about. That's very nice. But in terms of the overall distribution, the Gini coefficient, it's very difficult to figure out what it actually means. The same number can mean very different things in a very poor and a very rich society. And so you are like a juggler. You have to keep lots of balls in the air simultaneously to really make sense of what these metrics purport to show. And that's work that's not very often done, actually, because it's just so complex.
Yeah, and it seems like if we want more equality, there's two ways to do it. One is to kind of lift up the poor, and the other is to kind of tear down the rich. And it seems like it's almost always the case that it's the latter that happens, right? Where the accumulated wealth of the rich is eroded, confiscated, destroyed, or taxed away, right?
Unless you're very lucky, like the 30 years after World War II in Western countries, you have a very unusual situation. You come out of 30 years of crisis, World War I, Depression, World War II, Bolsheviks, the works, right? And, for about a generation or so, you can have it all. You can have economic growth and lower inequality, and the rich are still rich and the poor are less poor, and everything just comes together in the right way. And then it sort of fizzles out eventually for any number of reasons, right? Being endlessly debated. And you slide back ultimately into what seems to be the more normal configuration. If you have long periods of uninterrupted growth and development, you will see more divergence between rich and poor.
Now, why is that? I mean, it seems like an iron law. And when we go very back to the beginning, I know a lot of people emphasize how inequality has its origins in agriculture. And you say, well, not exactly, right? It has its origins in heritability, right, and in property, but it need not be agricultural. It could be a nomadic society, for instance, or a herding society.
And again, I'm not the first person to say this. People have been saying this in recent years, but it didn't really enter the mainstream, right, of our understanding of how history works overall. So farming per se doesn't create inequality. Using the plow, for instance, introduces inequality because some people have oxen, other people don't, and the people with oxen can farm more land, and they have more surplus and more resources, and they buy out the people with less land, and all of a sudden you wait long enough, you have big landlords and proletarians, and everything is very unequal. Then you have inheritance. You have to be able to pass this on to future generations. You have to have private property rights. But these are institutions that seem to emerge very early, in a sense, in history, thousands of years ago. They tie in with what states are trying to do, because states tend to be run by the rich and powerful, and they skew everything in a way to make sure it works best for them. So these are all elements that reinforce one another. And so the quintessentially typical agrarian state-level society would be one where you have a bunch of people who are both rich and powerful, and they make sure they retain their wealth through political power and latent violence and hold everybody else down. And these are very, very stable systems historically that you encounter over thousands of years. And the only way you can bring them down is by destroying the state. And there is periodic state collapse, Roman Empire, the various Chinese dynasties, the classic Maya, I mentioned the Maya before. These are periodically recurring events because early states are not very stable. They are far less stable than modern nation states are. They're more similar to Somalia or South Sudan in terms of their resilience and their stability. So state collapse still occurs in the world today, but it's a pretty marginal phenomenon that has to do with levels of development. So you could argue, well, as the state becomes more powerful, this particular way out goes away, sort of, right? You can no longer get rid of the state, and you don't want to get rid of the state because it's too important for how people live. And then you enter the 20th century, where you really see that major changes triggered by the very violent period between 14 and 45 with the world wars and the Bolshevik revolutions, which are really a corollary, right? They're part of these wars in Russia, in case of World War I for Russia and World War II. For China, so everything belongs together. It's one big cluster changes where any number of things happen, right? You get pushback against globalization, you have full employment, you have extremely high punitive taxation, you have state intervention in industry, you have a million things that temporarily favor the poor and disfavor the rich. And you come out of this, you build a welfare state, you have redistributive systems, it works really well for a while. And then, well, you shift towards liberalization, deregulation, in a number of things that if you wait long enough, generation or two, are going to promote higher levels of inequality.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one insight that pervades the book, it's that, right, the control of the state makes you rich, and being rich allows you to control the state, right? And so
For
there's
most
this,
of history, yeah.
yeah, there's this feedback loop where things get reinforced, right? The control of the instruments of power and the control of the instruments of wealth, they seem to be very closely connected.
That's very true. And of course, you could say, well, why doesn't democracy make a difference? And arguably, certain kinds of democracy do make a difference. If you go back to classical Athens, to return to the Greeks one more time.
Ancient Greece seemed to be like the great exception,
Yeah,
right?
because you don't have, I mean, they're rich people, but there are no monarchs, and the citizens, the male citizens are empowered. There's what we call a middle class, middling class. Middle class is a very anachronistic term, but a class of people who are not rich, not poor, but they have private property, they own their land, they're not normally in debt, they may own a few slaves, and they do fine, and they collectively control the political process. And in so doing, through plebiscites, right, they meet periodically, they deliberate, they pass referenda, we would say. The kind of thing that the framers of the US constitutions were worried about. They didn't want people to do that, right? We don't want that kind of direct democracy. We want a representative system what has more, order and stability, and the better people make sure nothing bad happens. And so the Athenians were not into this at all. They really want to empower a broad segment of society. And if you do that, you can actually push back against inequality as well, because then you pass policies that make sure the rich don't pull too far ahead. You tax them more, you draw them back in, and then the rich will behave accordingly. Right? They are going to change the way they display their wealth, and they become more civic-minded, at least ostensibly, right, in order to function in the system. So you can create a political culture where these things are possible. And if you look at Scandinavian countries, let's say for the sake of argument, last few generations, they get to something not quite like this, but not entirely dissimilar either, right? So it does depend on what kind of configuration of circumstances you have in place and how exactly your particular kind of democracy is configured. That has significant influences on whether inequality is going to be high or low. If you have a two-party system like in the US or in Britain, you are out of luck potentially, because the conditions are much more favorable to the kind of veiled plutocracy that we are now experiencing.
Well, methodologically, I'm curious how you dealt with the, control of the state. I mean, in the Middle Ages, it's clear that if you're a Plantagenet king or, a Valois king, like the state is private property. But when we fast forward to the 20th century, if you're the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, at least there's this on paper distinction between your private wealth and your public wealth. But in practice, I mean, this guy owns 80% of Aramco, you know what I mean? And so is that going to be counting in the statistics? Or if we think about, communism, wonderful equality on paper, but if you're in the Communist Party, you more or less control a factory and you control an entire ministry, and so, when we say Putin's one of the wealthiest people on earth, we're just referring to his bank accounts. We're not referring to the fact that he more or less owns, the entire government of Russia, right? So how do we think about, because in modern times we have these paper distinctions between the public and the private.
Yeah, for modern times it's an accounting trick. And in order to make sure we are looking at more or less the same things over time across very different periods, we have to stick to the current definitions in a way in terms of private property. So I didn't even try to estimate the kings and queens and the emperors are not really part of the equation when I go back in time, because they would distort the statistics even more and produce much higher Gini coefficients. Just one royal or imperial family would do that. I try to be conservative. And yet, even if you are conservative, you only look at what we would now consider to be private wealth sort of, in as much as that exists as a concept, you see very high levels of inequality, which are often as high as they could be in a very poor society. So I'll give you an example. I've tried to estimate a Gini coefficient for income in the Roman Empire, which is probably a bad idea because of all the uncertainties, but you can come up with some kind of rough estimate. And it's roughly the same as in the US. And then you get headlines saying, scholar discovers inequality in the US is as high as in ancient Rome. That is nominally true because it's the same number, but it means totally different things. Because in the Roman Empire, to reach that number, many people had to be really, really poor, right? They have to live at subsistence level. And there are just some rich people and a few middling people in between, and that's it. In the US, you can
Because you've got
line.
Pompey and you've got
Exactly.
Caesar.
You have all these super rich people, right?
Yeah.
And you get the super rich people today who are equivalent to, Pompey and Caesar and Crassus in the past. But you also have a huge middle class, which you don't have, because there's just more to go around. So you can reach the same level of inequality without experiencing the kind of dire destitution that you would get in pre-modern societies for the same level of inequality. And that's usually swept under the rug. So we have to be very careful when we do these diachronic comparisons.
Well, maybe we could walk through some of the various horsemen. War in particular, it seems like the nature of war has changed. So in the olden days, kind of, one army would beat another army, and it would really be more that the victor would appropriate the wealthy people in the victorious country would seize the assets of the wealthy people in the defeated country. And it was kind of like just a zero-sum transfer of a kind. It wasn't the kind of total destruction that you have in kind of modern warfare.
Very crudely speaking. And of course, it goes up and down even in the past, because sometimes you have mass mobilization, lots of infantry, and sometimes you have war chariots or knights on their horses, and they're very expensive to equip. So it varies with technological innovation over time, but very broadly speaking, if you win a war, you usually win something in much of history. The elite is going to win most, and then they will give some of it to the people who helped them, and the defeated party is going to lose. And that's true essentially all the way up, even to the US Civil War, for instance. It may be one of the last big wars of which this is true, that the North benefits from winning and the South doesn't. But if you go into the 20th century, things change. And because of industrialization, right, mass mobilization, you really need to genuinely mobilize the entire population, the entire adult population. Anyway, men, women, if they serve on the front, they work in factories, they do other things. It's a process that really changes the rules of the game, because you can't just tell people to do it. Well, maybe Stalin did, and even Stalin had to, appeal to patriotism and all kinds of things beyond the official ideology to make this happen. So you have to really be able to mobilize people, and that's very difficult if you try to maintain existing levels of inequality at the same time. Something has to give, and there at least are some studies now about how people realize this. They realize the powerful need us, right? They rely on us. And we now make all these sacrifices, but we expect something in return. Maybe not right now, but when the war is over, we really expect something in return.
Well, like the franchise, right? So
a franchise after World War I, and the welfare state mostly after World War II, but already with precursors after World War I. Yeah.
It's interesting to see what's going on in Russia, because it seems like the oligarchy has, for the most part, been sheltered from the impact of the war. Perhaps that's changing now, but it seems like rulers are trying to insulate their wealthy people, right? But at some point, it's going to crack, and we potentially will see more equality in Russia, say, after this war.
You would hope so, but then the war would have to be much worse than it already is. I mean, in a way, Ukraine would be more interesting, because Ukraine had extremely high levels of inequality after the collapse of the Soviet Union and immense corruption, magnates, and all that. I don't know how you would measure it right now. It's probably impossible to have any proper empirical measurement, but you would expect inequality perhaps to go down in Ukraine as a result of this. You can't be as openly corrupt anymore. There are higher taxes, I believe, to be paid. You have to mobilize the population more. It ought to have, it's a testable proposition, it ought to have some kind of at least moderately equalizing impact on distribution of income and wealth. And I don't know if that's true. I tried to find material, but it's really difficult right now, whereas Russia is much more shielded. As long as they have gas and oil to sell, they don't have to put more pressure on their people in terms of taxation, especially on rich people. You're not going to see a similar kind of effect.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you could talk also about the relative impact, because it seems like even the countries in World War II that were not deeply involved in the war seem to be impacted in terms of their inequality.
Yeah, it's very difficult not to be really involved. The Swiss were neutral in both wars and all wars since, I don't know when, Napoleon. And yet they had to mobilize. Well, they're very scared of what goes on right across the border. In World War One, the front line is basically right there, right between Germany and France. In World War Two, they are worried about the Germans just coming in and swallowing the country, which they could have done if they had really wanted to. So you have full mobilization. You have to pay for it. You have to really mobilize the citizenry for a number of years. The same is in Sweden. Sweden is neutral in World War One. Is not really threatened. Nothing happens. There's no change. In World War II, it's surrounded by Germany, but Germany occupied Germany, allied countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Denmark. It's really worried about a German takeover. The Germans want the iron ore that comes out of Sweden. Could have happened at any moment. The Allies could not have done anything about it for at least a number of years. So they have full mobilization. They build a war industry from scratch, right? That's why they still have a flourishing armaments industry, which they really boost and build up during those years to counter any kind of German aggression. And again, there are corollaries, progressive taxation, all these leveling mechanisms that you see in the belligerent countries also show up in Sweden to a lesser extent, but they do actually happen. And they prepare the ground for the takeover of the Social Democrats right after the war, just as you have a takeover of Social Democrats in Britain and many other places.
And I'm wondering if you could talk also about revolution, because it seems like, we've always had these rebellions, right? Peasant rebellions and, worker rebellions and so forth, but none of them seem to have made any kind of mark, really, until the 20th century.
No, because they always fail. They are not well organized enough. The elites always then are cohesive enough to really crack down. If it's the night slaughtering peasants in medieval Flanders or what have you, there's now the 500th anniversary of the big peasants' war in southern Germany. Nothing ends well, right? The rich get worried enough. They're able to draw in resources from elsewhere, hire mercenaries, do whatever it takes. They're really brutal, and their opponents are not terribly well organized or armed. That changes again. The Bolsheviks know exactly what they're doing. They try to capture the state institutions first. They work from the inside out. They're even more brutal. They build up an apparatus that really allows very aggressive leveling to happen. And it is part of the program. It's not a side effect. It is the agenda, right? Among other things. You want to get rid of the rich. You want to expropriate. You want to nationalize, expropriate, collectivize in the end in Russia, in China, in the various satellite regimes. And on paper, inequality falls to incredibly low levels. There's technically almost no wealth inequality, because if you get rid of most private wealth, there can't be much wealth inequality. Income inequality is regulated by the state, because the state decides if you're an engineer, you get this much more pay, but there are no huge pay differentials. Obviously, there's no income from equities or other assets. De facto, of course, there is real inequality, because the apparatchiks have access to nicer houses and healthcare and Western imported products and cognac, and they live like Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Yeah.
But there's, again, little formal inequality, but a lot of real inequality. So it depends on how you measure it. You suppress income and wealth inequality very successfully, and you create new inequalities in the process.
Mm. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about plague and disease. I mean, the most famous example, of course, is the Black Death, where it seems like the bargaining power of the poor was dramatically strengthened, right, because of the ratio of labor to land. I mean, is that always the case? And you also talk about the 30-Year War, and it seems like a lot of the damage that was done in the 30 Years' War was due to disease. It wasn't simply a matter of total war.
That's very true. There are essentially two outcomes to the Black Death itself in the late Middle Ages, which is just disease. I mean, there are other attendant problems, but it's mostly disease. If you have a country that has a fairly functional market system, a labor market like England did already, sort of, in this period. The shock works its way through the market, and it will. There are now far fewer laborers, right? So the employers have to pay more, and the employees can charge more. It's extremely straightforward. Then there are other systems that don't have functional labor markets, where you have a very powerful oligarchy that relies on means of oppression, that just call out their armed thugs, right, and crack down on people who try to ask for higher wages. And in those cases, you don't see the same development. You see instability because people rise up and they try to enforce their demands, but they can't. They are not sufficiently well organized. They're like the peasants we talked about earlier. So outcomes differ quite a bit depending on what the institutional landscape is. And then once you're in the 16th century with the 30 Years' War, there are now studies that came out after my book was published, taking the lead though from this, saying, oh, let's look at the local archives, not just in Italy and Spain and other places, but also in Germany. Lo and behold, if you look for them, you find them, right? They sit there. They sit in the basements in Germany, going back 500 years. You can actually look at them and analyze them, and people do more and more of this. You see the same effect. Because the loss of life in some parts of Germany is so extreme in the 30 Years' War. It's not just getting killed by combatants, it's famine, it's being sieges, destroying harvests, and pandemic, infectious disease. It all comes together, and it has the same effect. The rich are less rich. The poor are still kind of poor, but the rich are less rich. It's de facto also an episode of state collapse in some cases. So it's a really terrible pressure cooker environment, and it does measurably reduce economic inequality. And then with the returns of stability, inequality will continuously go up basically to the beginning of World War I in many cases.
Well, it seems like the Latin American case is an exception, because one would think that after, 90% of the population is wiped out by disease, this would be kind of a golden age, right, for the for the Native Americans. But unfortunately, the Spanish were there to, prevent that from happening. I mean, why wasn't the bargaining power of the natives sufficiently strong to create a more equal world post pandemic in the?
That's an excellent question. And it goes back to what I said about the Black Death. You usually have outcome number two, right? That the means of oppression are too powerful. They push, the problem is in the Black Death, you lose a third of the population. That's terrible, but it's not the end of the world. If you lose more than half or maybe an even larger share of the population, you do suffer a true undermining of any kind of established relationships and institutions, and even the ability of people to resist effectively. So the worse the outcome was, and it goes on for a long time, it's not one event, it goes on for generations. In the Americas, you're dealing with communities who are sufficiently weakened to not be able to put up enough of a fight to push back against the very exploitative demands of the colonizers who come in and they create these large estates and bonds person type labor and so on. And they may even bring in African slaves on top of it. And they create conditions that are just really terrible for the people who still live there. And then, of course, once the institutions are in place, the population recovers. You can see continuing population growth. And then all of a sudden people have less bargaining power anyway, but they're already trapped in these institutions that are set up in the phase of maximum weakness of the indigenous and maximum empowerment of the ruthless colonizers. It's a terrible equation, but it works out really well for the people in charge. And there are exceptions. There are exceptions from Mexico City and the surrounding area, where for a number of generations, the Spanish try to do that. They say, well, people die in droves, but we still won't pay higher wages. And at some point, it becomes unsustainable because they need to have things done, and the regulations are rescinded, and all of a sudden, real wages go up 200 or 300% because now workers can really charge what they deserve to be paid based on the, demand and supply. In terms of labor. But that's a relatively isolated phenomenon. There may be more exceptions that we don't yet know about, because again, the research being done on the ground in these case studies is being stimulated by the larger narratives and the bigger questions like my book tried to put out there. And maybe someone is working on this right now and we'll know more about this next year.
Now, one of the other conclusions of the book is that the Kuznets curve, which I think most people probably still believe it's a thing. I mean, it originated in that post-war period where people were very
Yeah.
optimistic, but the data doesn't seem to bear it out, right? It doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to hold.
Well, Kuznets, I mean, if you read his original work, which few people do, of course, they talk about the Kuznets curve and some paraphrase. He was a extremely brilliant guy, right? He knew what he was doing. He worked with the material he had at the time, and he does a lot of hedging. If you go for his article, that's like a 50-page article, right, the foundational piece, he's aware of all these things. He's aware of war and political factors and so on. And then people later sort of try to reduce it more, that there's an almost quasi-automatic relationship between economic development and first rising and then decreasing inequality. And of course, so it's not entirely fair to Kuznets at this point, right, to always single him out. And also he was gathering the data that were available to him at a time, and it seemed to be true, that you had a period of economic growth plus falling inequality. And so it's not unreasonable to conclude for someone like him to say, well, maybe there's a logic to this. And there was a logic to it. It's just a medium-term logic. It's not going to hold true forever. You could argue maybe he was right anyway, and there are multiple Kuznets curves, right? We are in a second Kuznets curve where we are in the upswing, because his was about urbanization and industrialization. That's essentially completed in rich countries. And you have another phase of development, service sector, expansion, IT, all the rest of it, globalization. Maybe that's a new curve. So it's not impossible that Kuznets was more right than we now give him credit for. You just have to think in terms of multiple curves. So that would be an alternative way of looking at it.
So, I mean, what would have to happen? I mean, it seems like there are certain political conditions that might allow for greater equality, right? I mean, and people in the American political system are aware of this. I mean, going back to Brandeis, people understood that if you were to somehow sever the connection between political power and wealth, that you could have forces tending towards equality. I mean, what are the prospects? Is there anything we can learn from the ancient Greeks that would help us navigate this inequality of today?
And it would seem to be very difficult to do in a market economy, in the kind of market economy we are used to, because then you have a tension between the capitalist system, so to speak, and the political power structure, where it's very difficult to cut out.
But it does seem, though, that if we think of the two sources of inequality as making and taking, it does seem like we have seen a transition from taking to making, right? I mean, there's still plenty of taking, but it does seem like at least the sources of inequality have shifted in the modern democracies to something that's at least remotely related to the production of wealth, as opposed to the seizing or stealing of wealth.
Yes, we live it's a modernized version of inequality creation. Right? It's no longer hitting people over the head and forcing them to hand over half of the harvest. It's about operating within a system in a way that makes sure you derive maximum benefit from your innovations and your investments and so on, which is, of course, good for everybody to some extent, right? That these operations and innovations occur, but it's disproportionately beneficial to the people who are, making the most of this. Which you could argue, well, as long as it delivers a degree of economic growth, we shouldn't really worry too much. And there's a strong case to be made. Should we should be more worry about poverty per se, however defined, right? Than about inequality as a metric.
Yeah, I think the concern is if you have wealth, you then use it to enhance your making with some taking, right? To cement your position.
Well, you want to keep more of what you got through making, so to speak. That's visible in our fiscal system and all that. There's no question about it. And globalization is a big factor in that too. If you have 200 countries, it's very easy to always, if someone really tried to come after you, it would be possible to just shift your interests and your assets around sufficiently to either deter those efforts or to still come out on top one way or the other.
Well, it does seem from this book that it is possible to do comparative history on a broad scale, not just sort of across countries, but across time periods. Is that something that's difficult to do given the kind of organizational structure of our departments and the journals and the way in which do you have to be sort of full professor and tenured to write this sort of thing?
It helps. I would even go a step further. I think it's essential to do comparative history. And that's something many of my colleagues would just not agree with. They think it's essential to know your stuff and know everything there is to know about your particular case. And I quite vehemently disagree. But just being able to do it, it's important to demonstrate that it's possible to do, that there are new opportunities, there are limitations you have to be, of course, clear about. But yeah, it can be done. It's possible to say things about times and places you're not an expert in, which runs counter, that takes us now full circle, the beginning of our conversation. It runs counter to the professional ethos that was developed 250 years ago. And in fact, the classicists were at the forefront of developing this particular ethos, saying you really have to know your languages, you have to know this and that. So, we are kind of stuck in that, right? We have to work within this template. And yes, to answer your question, helps to be a tenured full professor, because then you can get away with it and people will let you do this without any kind of penalty and might even appreciate your efforts.
Well, Walter, thank you so much for joining me. This is really a fantastic set of books. I've already ordered another book of yours to check out, but in the meantime, check out The Great Leveler and, of course, What is Ancient History?
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.